Hey there. Tonight, I want to begin with a god who did not always look gentle in the dark. Before he became a soft silver guardian drifting over sleeping temples, he was remembered in older words as something sharper, stranger, and much harder to hold in the mind. The moon above Egypt was not only beautiful, it was also a watcher, a blade, a vanishing thing that returned with perfect confidence, as if it knew secrets the sun never bothered to learn. So before we settle in fully, picture this with me. A pale disk rising over Thebes, the Nile breathing slowly below it, columns standing in shadow, and somewhere inside a temple wall, carved by patient hands, the memory of a god who could heal the sick, stalk demons, bend time, and wear the face of a child while carrying the patience of stone. If that sounds like your kind of midnight company, leave a like, subscribe, and stay with me as we follow him across the sky. Now let the room dim a little more. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders unclench and fall where they want to fall. Breathe in slowly. Hold nothing too tightly. And breathe out as if the night itself is getting heavier in the kindest possible way. There is no rush here. We are going to walk quietly, as if through cool temple halls, and let the story come toward us at the same pace as moonlight entering a room. Khonsu, that is the name we are following tonight. In the old Egyptian tongue, his name carries the sense of crossing, traversing, passing from one place to another. It is a beautiful name for a moon god, because the moon is never still. Not really. Even when it seems to rest above a palm grove or a line of distant hills, it is already traveling, already continuing its old and patient journey. Khonsu was the wanderer of the sky, the one who crossed the night, the bright traveler who slipped through darkness with the calm certainty of someone who knew every road before roads had names. I have always found that a little eerie in the best way. The sun can feel grand, obvious, almost theatrical. The moon is quieter. It arrives without much fuss. It leans over the world like a secret. And ancient Egypt understood that perfectly. The people who watched the Nile rise and sink, who built with stone and memory, who gave divine shape to wind, river, falcon, cow, a serpent, and star, did not look at the moon and see only a lamp in the sky. They saw a presence, a being, a divine intelligence moving through darkness with intent. The earliest traces of Khonsu do not present him as a sweet child with a polished temple and a line of gentle priests singing softly at dusk. No, the oldest memory of him is rougher than that. Stranger too. If you were to step into one of those early sacred spaces, with the smell of old plaster, lamp smoke, linen, and dust in the air, you would not have met a harmless moon boy. You would have met a force that belonged to the dangerous side of night. In the pyramid texts, those deep and solemn inscriptions carved for kings who hoped to survive death, Khonsu appears in a form that can still make the imagination sit up straight. He is described as Khonsu who lives on hearts. That phrase has survived the centuries like a shard of obsidian, dark, precise, difficult to soften. This early Khonsu was no smiling ornament of the sky. He was a devourer, a taker of vitality, a god associated with the hidden appetites of the dark. He moved through divine and mortal realms with the quiet menace of something lean and watchful. It is tempting, from a modern distance, to smooth that over, to say perhaps it was only symbolic, only poetic, only one of those old religious exaggerations people used to make. But honestly, that would rob the image of its power. The Egyptians knew the moon had more than one face. Anyone who has watched it thin to almost nothing, then vanish, then return can feel that without needing a lecture. The moon comforts. Yes. It also withholds. It brightens the path, then leaves the path in blackness. It watches harvests and births and kisses and boat journeys, but it also watches graves, fever, solitude, and the uneasy thoughts that arrive after midnight when everything in the house has gone still. That older Khonsu carried all of that. He embodied the uncertainty of lunar power, the way moonlight can make the familiar look strange. A garden becomes a place of shifting silhouettes. A river becomes polished metal. A sleeping city becomes a field of quiet roofs under a sky that seems too large. And if you were an ancient Egyptian lying awake beneath that sky, hearing dogs far off and reeds whispering by the water, perhaps the moon did not feel entirely friendly. Perhaps it felt alert, hungry, a presence that might guide, but might also judge. The old religious imagination was rarely interested in making the gods simple. That is one of the things I admire most about it. Egyptian divinity does not behave like a tidy shelf of labeled jars. A god can heal and destroy. A goddess can nourish and tear apart. A divine child can be ancient. A beautiful sky can hide a dangerous intelligence. Khonsu belongs to that world of layered meanings, and the earliest layer is not mild. It is hard silver, sharp shadow, and a moving light that never quite explains itself. If you were to stand beside a temple wall in those old centuries, placing your fingertips against stone still warm from the day, then waiting as the heat slowly leaves it, you might feel the whole theology in that one sensation. Warmth fading, coolness arriving, forms becoming outlines, certainty giving way to suggestion. Day belongs to one set of gods. Night belongs to another arrangement of powers. And here comes Khonsu, stepping into his hours. There is something almost predatory in the moon when you think about it long enough. Not in a crude way, not in a noisy way. More like the way a cat watches from a doorway without blinking. More like the way tide and body and sleep can all be touched by a thing that never comes down to explain itself. The Egyptians noticed those invisible influences. They noticed that time behaved differently at night. Thoughts behaved differently too. Illness could intensify. Dreams could deepen. Spirits, memories, grief, longing, all of it seemed to travel more easily after sunset. Of course, the moon god would hold power there. Of course, he would not be harmless. And yet, even in that old severe form, Khonsu was not merely a monster in the dark. He was divine order, wearing a frightening expression. That matters. Egyptian religion, for all its dazzling variety, almost always circles back to balance, to maintenance, to the ongoing work of keeping chaos from swallowing the world. Even the terrifying gods are often terrifying for a reason. The dark must be governed too. The things that move at night must answer to someone. The invisible hours need a keeper. Khonsu, in one of his oldest aspects, was exactly that. His appearance in these early texts suggests a deity whose lunar force could absorb strength, judge vitality, and perhaps even determine who remained protected under divine order and who did not. The image is severe, but not random. Hearts in Egyptian thought were not just organs. They were centers of being, memory, intention, truth. To live on hearts is to live on the very core of what a person is. That makes the old image more than gruesome. It makes it metaphysical. Khonsu, in this form, is not merely eating. He is taking essence. He is handling the interior weight of existence. I know, it is not exactly the sort of introduction that sounds cozy. Moonlight, soft pillows, and a god who lives on hearts. Not the most obvious bedtime combination. But mythology is funny that way. The more honestly you look at it, the more it rewards you. And one of the strangest rewards in the story of Khonsu is that this dangerous early figure does not disappear. He changes. He softens. He gathers new meanings. He becomes beloved. But somewhere inside, the beautiful later god, the old night hunter remains, patient as ever, like the dark edge of the moon no one sees during the full bright nights. As centuries passed, Egyptian religion evolved the way rivers shift their banks. Not all at once, not by denial, but by layering. New emphases emerged. Old traits were not always erased, only folded deeper into the divine personality. Khonsu began to move away from this stark, heart-taking figure and towards something more complex, more approachable, and in many ways more intimate. He became associated not just with the fear of lunar power, but with its rhythm, not only with danger, but with return. That change matters because the moon itself teaches it. The moon does not remain one thing. It swells, empties, disappears, returns. It frightens and reassures by turns. It makes promises by repeating itself. You can lose it and still trust it will come back. The Egyptians watched that long enough to understand that a moon god could not remain only a devourer. He had to become something cyclical, something renewing, something capable of crossing between terror and comfort without breaking his identity. And so the sharper edges of early Khonsu did not vanish, but they were eventually framed inside a larger, richer divine life. Later ages would see in him a youthful god, even a child, but not a weak one. A luminous son of Thebes, born into a sacred family. A traveler whose crossing of the night would become not only a threat, but a promise. A moon that could wane into invisibility and still return with perfect calm, as if to say that hidden things are not always lost. For now, though, let us stay just a little longer with the older memory. The dangerous moon. The silent watcher. The god whose presence, in the darkest texts, feels lean and cold and strangely beautiful. Imagine him not yet softened by temple hymns, not yet embraced as a divine child, but moving above the old landscape while the Nile slips through darkness and the burial fields lie quiet under the stars. Imagine ancient priests glancing upward and seeing not a decoration, but a power. not a symbol only, but a being crossing the sky with purpose. It is from that older, harder moon that the later Khonsu will emerge. That is what makes his story so compelling. He is not born gentle in the imagination. He becomes gentle without losing depth. He becomes beloved without becoming simple. And in the next movement of the story, when Thebes rises and the gods of that city shape him anew, we will see how the feared traveler of the early night becomes the child of Amun and Mut, the bright son of a divine household, and the moon itself begins to look less like a hunter and more like a promise carried carefully through the dark. When Khonsu steps into his softer form, he does not become smaller. That is the first thing to remember. He becomes more intimate. That is different. The old danger does not vanish. It simply learns how to sit inside a household, inside a temple, inside the rhythm of family and renewal. And that is where Thebes enters the story, not as a background city, but as the place that gave Khonsu a home, a mother, a father, and a sacred role that would let all of Egypt look at the moon with new affection. By the time the new kingdom lifted Thebes into brilliance, with its vast temple complexes, its processions, its priests, and its confidence, Khonsu had become woven into one of the most elegant religious arrangements in the Egyptian imagination. He was the child of Amun and Mut, their son, the bright youth of the Theban triad, a divine family shaped not merely for comfort, but for theology, politics, ritual, and the maintenance of the cosmos itself. It sounds almost domestic when said too quickly. Father, mother, child. But in Egyptian hands, nothing so sacred stays simple for long. Amun was not merely a father in the ordinary sense. He was the hidden one, the unseen force behind authority and creation, the god whose power could not be fully looked at without dissolving into mystery. Mut was not merely a mother with open arms and kind eyes, though she certainly contained tenderness. She was maternal force with claws if necessary, a goddess whose protection could feel like an embrace or like the sudden closing of a gate against all danger. And between them stood Khonsu, young in form, old in function, lunar in essence, always becoming, always returning. If you were walking toward Thebes at dusk in the age of great temples, perhaps by riverboat, with the current moving in dark folds around the hull, you would have seen the western cliffs already bruised with evening color, while the eastern bank held the last heat of the day. Columns would begin to cool. Painted walls would shift from gold to blue shadow. Priests would move in measured silence, sandals brushing stone. Somewhere, a bronze instrument might ring once, briefly. Somewhere, incense would begin to rise. And above all of it, the moon would prepare to appear, not as an isolated celestial object, but as the visible face of a god whose parents ruled from the deepest chambers of divine power. The story of his birth gathers around that atmosphere. According to the mature Theban theology, Khonsu emerged from the union of Amun and Mut, a cosmic event that did not happen in any ordinary field or palace room, but in the deeper architecture of divine creation. Their joining was understood as an event of generative balance, a meeting of hidden creative authority and maternal force. Out of that meeting came a lunar child, brilliant and fresh, yet carrying inherited power in both directions. From Amun he received mystery, hidden wisdom, and access to what is concealed. From Mut he received protection, nourishment, and the instinct to guard what must endure. What I love about this image is how naturally it suits the moon. The moon is both revealing and concealing. It brightens the edges of things while leaving their centers difficult to know. It nurtures rhythm, months, tides of ritual, and sleeping bodies. But it also belongs to silence, secrecy, and the hidden side of time. Khonsu, as child of Amun and Mut, becomes the living answer to that contradiction. He is what happens when hiddenness and motherhood meet under divine law. Some Egyptian traditions gave this conception an even more textured form. In certain tellings, Amun took the shape of a sacred bull, a force of virility, potency, and royal strength, while Mut appeared in a corresponding maternal form, sometimes linked with the celestial cow, sometimes with the vulture mother whose wings covered all beneath her. Their union in these versions was not earthy in a crude sense. It was cosmic fertility translated into symbol, body language for divine energy, too immense to speak plainly. From that union the child came forth radiant, already marked by lunar purpose. And here the mind can pause for a moment, because there is something touching in the Egyptian willingness to make great theology feel physically imaginable. They did not say only that the moon exists, and therefore a moon god must exist too. They gave the moon a family. They made celestial movement part of a household. They let cosmic continuity come into view as a son born from two powers who loved, generated, protected, and sustained the order of the world together. It is almost tender enough to make you forget how formidable all three of them could be. Khonsu's youth became one of his defining images. He is often shown with the side lock of youth, that elegant single lock hanging beside the head that marks him unmistakably as a divine child. But Egyptian divine childhood is not helplessness. It is potential in its most concentrated form. It is power that has not gone dull. It is freshness that does not cancel authority. In Khonsu's case, youth means renewal itself. The moon dies into darkness and returns. The child grows and is still somehow always the child. The month ends and begins again. Time falls apart and is stitched back together by rhythm. This made Khonsu especially important in a civilization that loved continuity with nearly stubborn devotion. Egypt built with stone because it wanted endurance. It wrote names because it wanted memory. It practiced ritual because it wanted repetition to hold the world in place. A youthful moon god who could disappear and return without failing became a perfect image of that desire. He was change without collapse. He was repetition without boredom. He was proof that what fades can come back, and that what is reborn need not be entirely new to be miraculous. The Theban triad, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, gave this idea architectural shape. In temple complexes, especially at Karnak, their relationship was not a vague theological suggestion, but a structured, sacred reality. Each deity had spaces, rituals, processions, and festivals that expressed their role in a unified divine household. Amun held supreme, hidden kingship. Mut embodied maternal sovereignty and defense. Khonsu carried renewal outward. especially into the night, where his moonlight made theology visible to anyone willing to look upward. If you were standing in a temple court during festival season, you might see this family theology translated into movement. Barks of the gods carried by priests, music beating softly through the stone, linen moving in warm evening air, torchlight trembling against painted reliefs, and among the solemn grandeur, the image of the divine Son, not ornamental, not secondary, but essential. The family was complete because time renews itself. Authority regenerates or it rots. Hidden power must become visible somewhere. Khonsu was that visibility. The older lunar gods were not entirely forgotten in this process. Egypt, like Mesopotamia, preferred layering to replacement. An earlier moon deity, Aya, had long carried lunar significance, and some of what once belonged to Aya flowed naturally into Khonsu. The same is true in a more complicated way with Thoth, who also held lunar associations, especially in relation to wisdom, measurement, and order. Egyptian religion was comfortable with overlap, provided the overlap produced richer understanding rather than confusion. Khonsu absorbed what served his role. The moon could belong to several theological registers at once. It could heal, count, guide, illuminate, and judge. That overlap is not a flaw. It is part of the beauty. Human beings rarely experience the moon in one way only. On one night, it is a calendar. On another, it is romance. On another, it is a cold witness. On another, it is a comfort for someone who cannot sleep. Egyptian religion allowed the god behind it to hold that same breadth. Khonsu inherited and gathered rather than merely replacing. He became the moon in a fuller sense because he carried traces of older lunar memory within his younger Theban identity. Mut's role in all this deserves more lingering than she sometimes receives. Her name simply means mother, which sounds gentle until you remember how much weight the Egyptians packed into motherhood. A mother is the one who forms, shelters, feeds, protects, and if needed, destroys whatever threatens the child. Mut is often linked to vulture imagery, and vultures in Egyptian symbolism were not morbid birds circling death as in so many modern imaginations. They were maternal beings, wings spread wide in protection, fierce in guardianship. So when Khonsu is said to be her son, it means he is not only born, but defended. He enters the cosmos under a shield. You can almost feel that if you imagine his birth not as a single instant, but as a slow opening in the sky, the dark waters of creation quiet, a hidden stirring, a silver pulse growing somewhere within the divine. Then the child appearing, not crying as mortal infants do, but shining. A moon child with skin like cooled metal, eyes carrying the depth of night, the sidelock glimmering as if each strand held a thread of moonbeam. It is a mythic image, yes, but it has the strange softness of something half-remembered rather than invented. Like a dream one is embarrassed to admit felt real. The Theban triad also offered a model of ideal balance, and that balance mattered politically as much as spiritually. Amun as father resembled divine kingship, hidden but supreme. Mut embodied protective sovereignty and legitimacy. Khonsu represented the continuation of that order into the future. In a world where dynasties could crack, foreign powers could intrude, and memory itself had to be guarded against erosion. The image of a divine family whose sun renews the cosmic cycle every month was not just pretty theology. It was reassurance. It told Egypt that the line continued. It told temples that ritual still worked. It told families that birth and return belonged to the structure of things. This may be why Khonsu remained youthful even when his powers clearly exceeded anything childlike. His form says one thing. His function says another. The combination is deliberate. The moon looks smaller than the sun, but no one who has ever stood under a bright full moon in a silent place thinks of it as weak. Its power is not blinding, but persuasive. It touches sleeping rooms, empty courtyards, river surfaces, animal eyes, burial fields, mountain ridges. It changes mood without asking permission. Khonsu's youth works like that. He enters the imagination gently, then fills it. The relationship between Amun and Khonsu also deserves a quiet pause. Amun is hiddenness, invisible kingship, the power behind forms. Khonsu is visible movement through the night. In a way, the sun reveals what the father withholds. The moon crossing the sky is like hidden divinity, agreeing, briefly, to be seen. Not fully, never fully, but enough. Enough to guide a boatman, enough to mark the month, enough to let a priest know the right night for a rite, enough to let a sleepless person in a mud brick house feel that the dark is inhabited by order rather than only by fear. And mute, standing between them, in theology, even while being mother to one and consort to the other, becomes the one who gives continuity emotional shape. She is the one who makes divine power feel inhabitable. Without her, the triad might feel abstract. With her, it feels embodied, warm in one instant, ferocious in the next, exactly like life under divine protection. There is a reason Egyptian artists could give goddesses such serenity in the face and such deadly symbolism in the crown. Tenderness and danger are not opposites in that world. They are duties performed according to circumstance. If you were to rest for a moment beneath a Theban colonnade at night, back against cool stone, and imagine the triad as the priests imagined them, you would not see a static family portrait. You would see process, hidden authority generating visible renewal, maternal force sheltering cyclical return, youth carrying the burden of time without ever appearing tired. The moon above you would no longer be only a bright object, but the sun of divine power and divine protection, crossing his road faithfully. This is where Khonsu becomes truly beloved. Not because he loses mystery, but because he carries it in a face people can approach. The old lunar terror is still there in the background, but now it is held within a larger story, one with relationship, inheritance, and return. He can still unsettle. He can still command, but he also belongs to a home, and by belonging there, he becomes capable of belonging to the hopes of ordinary people as well. For some, he would be the moonchild who proved things could return after vanishing. For some, he would be the son of mighty parents whose authority reached into every corner of Egypt. For some, he would be the visible sign that the cosmos was still arranged with care. And for others, perhaps especially those awake late at night with illness, grief, or too much thought in the chest, he would simply be the pale traveler above the rooftops, crossing over again, keeping time, not forgetting the world below. Soon, we will follow him out of the temple household and into the sky itself, where the child of Amun and Mut takes on the lonely and beautiful labor of becoming the moon in motion, crossing east to west, brightening, dimming, disappearing, and returning with the stubborn calm of a god who understands that renewal is not a single miracle, but a duty repeated forever. If you have ever watched the moon rise slowly enough to notice that it does not leap into the sky but seems to think its way upward, then you already understand something essential about Khonsu. He was not imagined as a fixed ornament pinned to the dark. He was movement itself. He was the crossing. Night after night he traveled, and the Egyptians, who measured so much by recurrence, treated that journey as one of the great, disciplined labors of the cosmos. Once the sun god withdrew, and the heat of day loosened its grip on stone, Khonsu began his work. The western horizon still held a little copper glow. The Nile still remembered light in narrow ripples. Birds settled into reeds. The last voices in the courtyard softened. Then, somewhere above the roofs and pylons, the moon appeared, perhaps as a curved blade, perhaps as a fuller lamp, depending on the night. And with it came the sense that a divine traveler had stepped onto his road again. Egyptian religion did not leave this as simple astronomy. The moon was not merely visible. It was enacted. The rise of Khonsu marked a transfer of cosmic labor. Ra had carried the burden of daylight. Now the younger god took the dark shift, if I can put it that way, and there is something almost endearing in that thought. The gods, for all their grandeur, still had duties. The universe was not running on applause. Somebody had to cross the night and keep the hours from spilling everywhere. Ancient temple texts describe this voyage as active and exacting. Khonsu emerged from hidden regions after sunset and entered the visible sky through a divine threshold in the east. He did not drift there by accident. He passed through guarded cosmic space, moved among stars with intention, and carried the timing of the world in his progress. His phases, waxing and waning, were not seen as random changes in brightness. They were the visible evidence of a god moving through cycles of growth, fullness, decline, disappearance, and return. That is one of the reasons his worship became so intimate. A god who dies a little every month and then returns is a god people can bring into the private chambers of worry. Farmers could trust him. Mothers could trust him. Priests could calculate with him. Travelers could raise their heads and ask for a little help from him. The moon changes, yes, but it changes in a pattern. Khonsu made uncertainty bearable by submitting it to rhythm. Imagine his path over Thebes. First, the eastern rise. Then the steady climb over courtyards and temple roofs, over river barges tied for the night, over sleeping servants, restless nobles, whispering lovers, scribes finishing a line by lamplight, guards standing straight, though their feet ached. The moon would lay silver on limestone and make black water look like folded cloth. Palm fronds would become ink drawings. Statues would appear to breathe in the half-light. And all the while Khonsu was crossing, never still, carrying the month with him. The full moon was the hour of his greatest public confidence. At that moment he seemed complete, almost royal in the sky, and his authority widened. Ancient priests linked this fullness with potency, clarity, and access. If the dark was full of unseen things, then the full moon was the night when the unseen became easier to read. Rituals intensified, healing rites strengthened, dreams grew weightier. Words said under such light were not casual things. They carried farther in the imagination and perhaps, if one was devout enough, farther in the divine hearing as well. Then came the waning. This is where Khonsu becomes even more beautiful to me. He does not cling to fullness. He gives it up. Night by night, the round face narrows. Light thins. Shadow takes back ground. And yet this is not failure. It is offering. Egyptian thought often understood, diminishing not as defeat, but as participation in the larger order. Khonsu loses radiance as part of the work. He descends toward invisibility because return requires disappearance. No honest cycle can be all ascent. During the darkening phase, his role shifted. The moon with less light invited deeper mystery. Khonsu's power was not gone. It was hidden. This mattered enormously in a civilization that treated hiddenness not as absence, but as another mode of being. Amun was hidden. Seeds were hidden. The dead passed into hidden places. The sun itself entered invisible realms each night. Khonsu, as son of hidden divinity, did not cease when unseen. He labored elsewhere. The new moon, when he seemed gone, represented his passage through darkness so complete that mortal eyes could no longer follow him. For ordinary people, that might have felt unsettling. For priests and theologians, it was a necessary interval. Khonsu had entered the underworld side of his office. He was no longer only the visible moon above the earth, but a deity moving through unseen corridors where the dead traveled and where the order of the next cycle had to be prepared. This made him more than a time marker. It made him a mediator. The path of the moon became a kind of celestial instruction on how to survive endings. Khonsu vanished and still remained Khonsu. He disappeared without surrendering identity. He entered darkness without being conquered by it. I suspect that gave comfort to many people who would never have described the idea in theological language, but felt it all the same when they saw the first crescent return after a moonless stretch of nights. The world had not been abandoned. The traveler was back on the road. His relation with the stars deepened this imagery. Egyptian texts sometimes treat celestial bodies as divine companions, stations, witnesses, even officials in a cosmic administration. Khonsu did not wander through empty black. He moved through a populated heaven. The imperishable stars, those that never seem to set, were old and dependable presences. Other star groups marked routes, seasons, and sacred timings. The moon god among them was a moving envoy, carrying awareness between regions of the sky, by extension, between dimensions of reality. There is something almost administrative about it when you strip away the glitter. Night had to be governed. The heavens required coordination. Certain powers were solar. Others belonged to shadow, dream, sickness, spirit, and fate. Khonsu's journey was therefore not decorative, but functional. He oversaw thresholds. He illuminated roads. He marked lawful recurrence. He made sure darkness remained under divine management rather than dissolving into raw chaos. That last point is easy to miss from a modern distance because we are used to streetlights, clocks, lit windows, and the dull hum of electricity making night feel tamed. Ancient night was a different country. It had shape, yes, but not safety by default. If you stepped outside after midnight, beyond the ordered heart of a city, the dark was substantial. It touched the skin. It changed the sound of your own breathing. Moonlight in such a world was not a luxury. It was governance. That is why Khonsu's travel also became linked to guidance for the dead. If a god knows the roads of darkness, then he can guide those who must pass through them. Funerary imagination in Egypt made generous use of celestial imagery, and the moon's path offered a model for continuity after apparent extinction. The deceased, like Khonsu in his monthly cycle, might pass through hidden regions and emerge renewed. Tomb texts, amulets, and ritual language drew strength from exactly this kind of cosmological confidence. You can feel it in the way Egyptian burial culture refuses to let death become merely a wall. It is a crossing, a judgment, a transformation, a continuation under conditions more severe and more refined. Khonsu's own cycle became proof of concept. Vanish. Travel unseen. Return. What he enacted above could reassure what was hoped for below. As his importance grew, so too did his practical influence over calendars and timing. The moon's phases offered a natural measure for months, and Khonsu as living moon, therefore, became a regulator of time itself. Not in the abstract way that philosophers love to talk about time, but in the stubborn everyday sense that actually matters. When to plant. When to hold festival. When a healing rite should be performed. When a journey should begin. When certain rites for the dead were most fitting. A civilization runs on these choices, and Khonsu stood quietly behind many of them. The Egyptians were excellent observers, and their religious life did not float above observation. It grew from it. Priests tracked lunar phases carefully because theology and agriculture and ritual timing all leaned on that knowledge. Khonsu was therefore a god whose behavior could be watched. That gave his worship a rare intimacy. You did not only hear stories about him, you could step outside and see what he was doing. I think that matters more than we sometimes admit. A god whose activity is visible invites a different sort of devotion. You cannot easily claim he has abandoned his route when there he is above the river, doing what he has always done. You may feel alone, but the moon still crosses. You may fear disorder, but the nights still arrive in countable form. You may lose someone you love, but the crescent still returns. A visible cycle can hold a civilization together more effectively than 1,000 speeches. Khonsu's waxing also became associated with increase in strength, healing force, and beneficial momentum. During the nights when his disk grew larger, one could imagine divine energy accumulating. It is easy to see how healing cults would take hold under that pattern. The body that weakens could strengthen. The mind that breaks could be gathered. The afflicted person could could endure a few more nights because the moon itself was modeling return to fullness. Even if recovery was slow, the sky had already explained that slowness need not mean failure. When he reached full brilliance, Khonsu stood not only as the moon, but as proof that the cosmos tolerated recovery. That is no small theological statement. A world can be cruel and still make room for restoration. Egyptian religion, for all its severe judgments and intricate rules, never lost interest in restoration. The moon restored itself every month. The Nile restored the land yearly. The dead hoped for restoration. Broken order demanded restoration. Khonsu's entire visible life was an argument that loss need not have the final word. Then he would diminish again, and this too had meaning. The waning moon taught limits. No intensity remains at peak forever. No king stays mighty without change. No body keeps every strength. No joy remains untouched by sorrow. The moon that declines without disgrace suggests a dignified surrender to cycle rather than a collapse into meaninglessness. Khonsu could become less visible and still remain divine. That idea alone must have softened many nights. The transition points between him and Ra were especially important. Dawn and dusk were not casual edges of the day. They were negotiated borders. When the moon remained visible near sunrise, or appeared before the last afterglow of sunset had faded, it would not have been read as mere overlap. It signaled coordination between divine offices. The solar and lunar powers met in these liminal moments, handed over authority, and ensured no gap opened in the governance of the world. I love that image. Even the gods keep good records and shift changes. Temple ritual reflected this precision. Priests knew that heavenly order required earthly imitation. So lamps were lit, doors were opened or sealed, words were recited, incense was offered, and the movement of sacred objects through temple space echoed the movement of divine powers through cosmic space. Khonsu's journey across the sky had its counterpart below in processions and observances that kept earth and heaven in dialogue. And there is another layer too. Because Khonsu crossed the night, he naturally became associated with those who crossed danger. Travelers at night, whether on river or road, had reason to think of him. A little moonlight on a difficult path is a practical blessing before it is ever a symbol. A boatman on dark water needed vision. A messenger crossing open land after sunset needed orientation. A caravan moving by cooler night hours needed a god whose attention was strong after the sun had gone. Khonsu offered that. By now you can probably feel how his journey through the sky prepared the way for the next transformation in his story. A god who rules the moon, marks time, moves through darkness, guides the dead, and watches the vulnerable by night is already standing very close to the threshold of healing. He knows what is hidden. He knows what afflicts in darkness. He knows cycles of loss and return. He knows routes out of danger. It is only natural that people would begin to call on him not just as traveler, but as physician of the unseen hours. And that is where the story leads next. The moonchild of Thebes, who crossed the night with such measured patience, would become something even more beloved. Not merely the god who moved above the sickbed, but the one who could lean down into it. Not merely the keeper of the dark road, but the one who could drive out what lurked along it. In the next part, we will enter that softer, but no less powerful realm, where Khonsu, the celestial traveler, becomes Khonsu the healer, the protector, and the god whose light was said to press gently even into minds and bodies that had nearly lost their way. By the time Khonsu became known as a healer, the moon had already taught Egypt half the lesson. A light that returns after vanishing is very close to a medicine. A god who moves through darkness without becoming lost is already halfway to becoming a rescuer. And a deity who governs the unstable hours of the night will inevitably be asked to look in on unstable bodies, unstable minds, and hearts that feel as if they have slipped loose from their proper place. This is how Khonsu's reputation deepened, not by abandoning his lunar identity, but by letting that identity sink into human need. The moon's effects were visible everywhere if one paid attention in the old way. Sleep changed under it. Dreams changed under it. Tides of mood seemed to answer it. Fevers rose and broke in the dark. The distressed became more distressed after sunset. Those suffering from fear, confusion, possession, or inner turmoil often worsened at the very hours when the moon ruled the sky. If a god held authority there, then surely he could also restore order there. Egyptian healing was never only physical. That is worth saying quietly and clearly. The body, the soul, the mind, the heart, the name, the protective field around a person, all of these could suffer disturbance. A person might be ill because of injury, infection, curse, malevolent spirit, broken balance, divine displeasure, or some terrible mixture of several at once. The physician, the priest, the magician, and the ritual specialist often worked along neighboring lines. Khonsu fit beautifully into that world because the moon already belonged to thresholds where the visible met the invisible. Temple inscriptions and ritual traditions increasingly present him as a being who could soothe what ordinary medicine could not reach. This did not mean physicians became useless. Quite the opposite. The best Egyptian healing often involved layered care, herbs, bandaging, spoken formulae, amulets, cleansing, dream incubation, offerings, timing, and divine appeal could all work together. Khonsu entered the system not as a replacement for practical treatment, but as the power that made healing complete when the affliction had roots in darkness, spirit, terror, or disturbed time. The image is almost impossibly moving when you linger with it. Somewhere in Thebes, perhaps in a side chamber, cool with stone and faintly scented with incense, a sick person is laid down carefully. Family members wait nearby, trying not to speak too loudly. A priest enters with measured steps. The patient's breathing catches. Lamps are adjusted. Silver glints from an amulet or vessel. Outside, the moon is rising, and everyone in that room knows that they are not merely hoping for medicine. They are hoping to be found by a god who crosses the night and knows how to handle what hides there. Khonsu's healing power was especially associated with afflictions of the mind and spirit. That makes sense the more you think about it. The moon does not only light landscapes. It touches inner weather. Ancient people across cultures noticed that human thought could become strangely vulnerable under certain conditions of darkness. Isolation, exhaustion, grief, and fear. Egypt gave this vulnerability religious language. Malevolent entities, hostile inflames, intrusive spiritual forces, or disorders of soul and heart could seize a person and distort them from within. Khonsu, because he knew the hidden roads, became a natural divine physician for such cases. Priests serving him developed rituals that worked through sleep, chant, symbol, and timed petition. The patient might be purified first with water and fumigation. Protective words would be spoken. Small figures or amulets bearing lunar symbolism could be placed nearby. The afflicted person might then be encouraged or ritually guided into sleep, because dream and sleep were doors, and Khonsu was particularly strong at doors. If the illness lived in hidden regions of the self, then the healer must go where the illness had hidden. There is something astonishingly modern in that, though I do not say modern to flatten it. I only mean that the Egyptians understood that some suffering cannot simply be cut out or bound up from the outside. It must be entered. It must be confronted in the deep chambers where fear or distortion has made its nest. Khonsu's power lay there. He was said to enter those inward night spaces with lunar radiance and bring things into order. The stories of these healings grew in temple memory, and the greatest of them all would make his name travel beyond Egypt. It is the account of the foreign princess, the woman from Bedtime, whose illness became a diplomatic crisis and a test of divine medicine. The story survives in inscriptions that are half history, half devotional theater, and entirely magnificent. The tale begins with a political marriage, as so many ancient troubles do. A princess from the distant land of Bedtime came into the orbit of Egypt through alliance and statecraft. She was valuable not only as a person, which is already tragic enough to think about, but as a living bond between kingdoms, a breathing treaty dressed in fine linen and royal expectation. But after her arrival, or in some versions, after her connection to Egypt had been established through her sister, she became terribly afflicted. The symptoms are described in ways that suggest possession or severe spiritual illness rather than ordinary bodily disease. She suffered in mind and spirit. Her condition resisted all ordinary treatment. Court physicians could do nothing. Priests consulted their knowledge and found no easy answer. The matter grew heavier because her sickness was not private. When a royal woman connected to international diplomacy falls into a state no one can cure, the entire political order begins to sweat. I always find that detail wonderfully human. Empires build monuments and speak of eternity. Then one person in one chamber becomes ill in a way no one understands. And suddenly all the gold and protocol in the world looks fragile. That is the sort of thing mythology remembers well. The Egyptian court finally turned to Khonsu, not to the moon as abstraction, but to Khonsu in his active healing presence, the god whose power could enter hostile spiritual terrain and emerge victorious. A sacred statue of the god was prepared and sent on a long journey to the foreign land. This matters. The healing was not imagined as a distant divine wave casually tossed across the desert. The god traveled, or rather, his power traveled in embodied sacred form. Picture the scene. The statue prepared in temple stillness, polished, vested, awakened by ritual. Priests reciting with low, steady voices. Incense flowing upward in threads. Offerings laid down, the image no longer mere material, but the place where divine presence agreed to gather. Then the departure, the sacred escort moving outward from Egypt, with the healer god carried toward the suffering princess in a foreign court. When Khonsu's image arrived, the possessing entity recognized the danger at once. In the story, the spirit speaks with awareness and fear. It knows who has come. It knows this is not a local rite it can shrug off. Khonsu enters the chamber not as a pleading protector, but as an authority whose lunar power can expose, corner, and expel whatever has embedded itself in the vulnerable person. The healing itself is described with the gravity it deserves. Khonsu confronts the spirit. The invading force submits. The princess is released. And when she recovers, it is not partial or uncertain. It is clear, immediate in effect, complete in implication. The political alliance is saved. The foreign king is impressed. Egypt's divine prestige expands. Khonsu's reputation as healer crosses borders. What makes the tale so rich is that it combines several of his roles at once. He is healer, yes, but also traveler, because he must journey to the distant land. He is protector of diplomacy, because the case involves royal relations between kingdoms. He is master of hidden affliction, because the illness is not merely physical, and he is a divine presence carried through material image, reminding us that Egyptian religion was wonderfully comfortable with sacred embodiment. Gods could be invoked anywhere, but they could also arrive. There is a tenderness beneath the grandeur, too. At the center of all the diplomatic consequence, there is still simply a sick woman in distress, and a god asked to help her when no one else can. The myth never quite lets me forget that. Beneath the inscriptions and theology, someone suffered, and the story insists that moonlight reached her. Khonsu's healing role expanded naturally from there. He became protector against demons, disturbances, wandering spirits, and all manner of unseen malice. His lunar light was imagined as able to expose what preferred concealment. A possessing force can live comfortably in darkness until a better darkness arrives, one that belongs not to chaos but to divine law. Khonsu brought that better darkness. He was night disciplined into order. This is an important distinction. Egyptian theology did not aim to eliminate darkness, because darkness was part of reality. It aimed to govern it. Khonsu's healing does not abolish the night. It makes the night inhabitable again. That is why he is so compelling. He does not solve suffering by denying its environment. He enters its environment and rearranges the terms. He was also called upon for bodily healing, especially where timing and cyclical restoration mattered. Illness that rose and fell, weakness that seemed to move in waves, recurring fevers, exhaustion, wasting, and conditions associated with disturbed sleep or spiritual imbalance all fit naturally under his care. His link with the monthly cycle also tied him to fertility, regeneration, and the return of strength after depletion. A body that wanes can wax again. That is the moon's promise made medicinal. The priests who served him would have understood this not merely as poetry, but as applied sacred knowledge. Different lunar phases could intensify different rituals. The waxing moon favored strengthening and increase. The full moon supported maximum divine potency. The waning moon could be used to diminish hostile influences, weaken intrusive spirits, or strip force from malign conditions. In that sense, Khonsu was not just a healer, but a physician of timing. He knew when to build, when to expose, when to reduce, when to conclude. That sense of timing is one reason he later became associated with more than illness. Travelers prayed to him, especially those moving through danger at night. People in states of transition asked for his oversight. Those awaiting dreams, signs, or judgments paid attention to his phases. The moon god who heals is also the moon god who guides. Recovery itself is a journey. The two functions belong together more neatly than they first appear. And then there is the emotional texture of his healing, which I think matters greatly. Khonsu is not usually imagined as healing through soft domestic affection alone, though tenderness is present. He heals with alertness, with exactness, with a kind of luminous authority. If a child woke in fear, one could pray to him. If a traveler crossed dangerous country, one could pray to him. If a person seemed altered by something dark and inward, one could pray to him. But in every case, the appeal carried the same assumption. Khonsu would notice. He was not sleepy divinity. He was a watcher in motion. That gives his comfort a different flavor than that of a mother goddess or a solar patron. It feels cool, clarifying, like a basin of water touched by moonlight, like a fevered mind suddenly able to distinguish one thought from another, like the sense that the room is still dark, but something in the dark now belongs to you rather than to what frightens you. You can imagine how powerfully such a god would appeal to ordinary people. Not every person needed a cosmic theology each evening. Many simply needed help with what the night did to them. The grieving, the sleepless, the anxious, the ill, the haunted, the ones waiting for someone to return by river or road, the parents sitting beside a restless child, the old man who feels his body weakening in cycles he no longer controls, the young woman fearing a dream will come again. Khonsu's moon passed over all of them. His cult offered not merely doctrine, but proximity. Temple worship made that proximity durable. Shrines, statues, inscriptions, festivals, and priestly services gave the anxious a route by which to address the god. You did not have to climb into the sky. You could go to his house on earth. You could bring offerings. You could request amulets. You could sleep within sacred precincts, hoping for dream healing. You could trust that the moon above and the ritual below spoke to each other. His title as healer did not erase the fiercer possibilities within him either, and that may have made the healing more believable. A god who cannot fight cannot truly protect. Khonsu could do both. He could soothe the afflicted person and terrify the affliction. He could stand at a bedside like a physician and at the same time like an executioner of what had no right to be there. The line between these two functions is thin in Egyptian thought. Healing often requires expulsion. Restoration sometimes requires battle. That tension prepares us for the next movement of his story. Because the god who drove out the demon from the foreign princess and watched over sleepers by silver light was also the god who could become terrible when cosmic order itself came under threat. The healer had claws beneath the linen. The youthful moon could darken into something sharp enough to hunt chaos, And in the next part, we will have to follow him there, into the older and harder regions of his nature, where the gentle physician becomes the devourer again, the guardian who protects not by soothing alone, but by striking with frightening precision when the night grows lawless. There are gods who comfort by standing still, and there are gods who comfort by hunting what would harm you. Khonsu, once his healing aspect had fully entered Egyptian imagination, could no longer remain only soft silver light over sickbeds and temple roofs. A deity who crosses the dangerous hours cannot simply soothe. He must also defend. He must know when tenderness is enough and when darkness has become insolent enough to require claws. This older and more fearsome side of him never truly vanished. It had been there from the beginning, back in the oldest religious strata, when he appeared in language sharp enough to make later worshippers lower their voices. In those early formulations, he was not merely the moonchild of Thebes, not yet the elegant son of Ammon and Mut, whose calm radiance drifted over the Nile. He was a consuming force, a being linked to the taking of hearts, to the seizure of vital essence, to the cold certainty that not everything wandering in the dark had the right to keep wandering. It is tempting to soften this side of him too quickly, because the later healer is so appealing. But Egyptian religion rarely works by flattening a god into one mood. The same power can bless and break. The same hand can lift a fevered child and strike down a cosmic intruder. If Khonsu knew how to restore order inside a troubled mind, then he also knew how to confront what had broken that order in the first place. One cannot be the physician of the night without, at times, becoming its judge. The transformation into his warrior aspect was imagined not as a contradiction, but as a release of concealed capacity. During peaceful nights he moved in beauty. During threatening nights he changed. The shift is described in later imagination as something visible and terrible. The soft lunar brightness that outlined his youthful form deepened toward a hard blue black, like the sky just before dawn when it still refuses mercy. His eyes, once cool and watchful, became points of cutting fire. The crescent above his brow no longer resembled a delicate emblem. It resembled a blade. Even his youth altered. He did not become old exactly. He became ancient in a different register, like something that had always known where the predators hide. What called forth this aspect was not ordinary human wrongdoing. Khonsu was not imagined as a god darting downward every time someone lied about grain or quarreled with a neighbor. The threats that summoned his fiercer form were larger and stranger. Demons loose beyond their proper bounds. Entities of contamination. Forces born from the long struggle between order and chaos. Things that fed on weakness, stole orientation, and tried to widen the cracks through which the world might slip back toward formlessness. The Egyptians understood chaos not as colorful rebellion, but as a patient unmaking, a bent measure, a false path, a distortion of shape, season, and speech. It could enter battlefields, courts, sick rooms, desert roads, and dreams. It could wear masks. It could wait. Khonsu's task in his terrible form was to prevent such forces from establishing residence. He was not war for the thrill of war. He was violent correction applied where structure was at risk of coming apart. The old image of him as eater of hearts belongs here, and it deserves to be understood properly. The heart in Egyptian thought was no casual organ. It was memory, intention, moral texture, identity, the seat of what one truly was. To consume a heart was not merely to destroy a body. It was to end the continuity of a being's capacity to act in the world. So when Khonsu was said to live on hearts, the idea was dreadful precisely because it suggested total judgment. The enemy was not merely struck down. It was deprived of future malice. Its inward center was taken from it. That sort of divine severity becomes easier to grasp when we imagine the kinds of opponents he faced. One important category was the brood of disorder associated with the wider serpentine powers of chaos. Not always Apophis himself, the great enemy of the solar passage, but the lesser spawn, the fragments, the creeping derivatives of that older hostility. These beings did not usually appear as grand, dramatic monsters in every myth. More often, they manifested like infections in the fabric of things, corrupted currents in sacred precincts, disturbed weather, sudden madness among animals, repeated failure of ritual, fear spreading without visible source. Khonsu, because he moved nightly across the vulnerable borderlands, could perceive these disturbances before they became irreversible. Imagine him crossing the sky in one of his fuller phases, calm and silver over fields and temple towers, then sensing a stain below. Not visible to mortal sight, perhaps. A distortion in the order of stars over one district. A pocket of wrongness gathering above a shrine. A tomb, or a road where several travelers had vanished. The moonlight, that for ordinary eyes looked pale and lovely, would for Khonsu become investigative. He would descend, not in panic, but with the dreadful patience of someone who has done this before. One tradition imagines his confrontations with chaotic intrusions as hunts rather than battles. That feels right. Battle suggests two recognized sides meeting openly. Hunt suggests tracking, exposure, the pursuit of something that has no rightful place and therefore no legitimate banner. Khonsu's lunar power gave him unusual advantages in such pursuit. Moonlight exposes edges. It does not flood a space the way sunlight does. It picks out the hidden seam, the movement in reeds, the shine of an eye that hoped to remain unseen. In mythic terms, that meant he could reveal the true form of deceptive beings. Illusion belonged to darkness without witness. Khonsu brought witness. His claws, when described, are not merely animal embellishments. They are the physical grammar of lunar precision. He does not bludgeon chaos. He opens it, cuts it apart where it has knitted itself into lawful things. One can almost see him in temple relief style, slim but terrible, reaching into a knot of shadow and drawing from it the writhing center of corruption, while stars look on with the cold interest of old officials watching an arrest long expected. In some versions of his warrior work, he also had wings, hawk-like or falcon-sharp, because pursuit in the Egyptian imagination often demanded aerial sovereignty. The enemy tries to flee upward, downward, outward, into marsh, cloud, desert, heat, shimmer, underworld, cleft. Khonsu follows. The moon sees too much for flight to succeed. That is one of the secret comforts of his fiercer mythology. Terrorus, Yes, but terrorists on behalf of order. The thing hunting you in the dark may escape your sight. It does not escape the moon's. There are hints, too, that Khonsu's violence was not only physical, but ontological. If I may put it in a sleepy way, he attacks the mode of being by which disorder persists. His enemies may survive blows from lesser powers, but when he reaches the heart, the essence, the active center, their continuity is broken. In modern language, we might say he disables the pattern rather than just the appearance. The ancient texts would say it more beautifully and more frighteningly. He takes what lets them go on. One of the great imagined campaigns of this aspect concerned rebellious stellar beings, stars or star spirits that had abandoned proper alignment and sought private glory. This mythic theme fits Egyptian religious logic rather well. The stars are not random ornaments. They are participants in cosmic order. To rebel is not merely to shine elsewhere. It is to endanger orientation itself. Sailors, priests, calendar keepers, funerary rites, all rely on trustworthy heaven. If the lights above become arrogant, everything below suffers. The rebel stars in later imagination had moved beyond appointed paths, feeding on stolen brilliance and drawing lesser lights into their orbit. Their region of sky had become unstable, a beautiful danger. Mortals below might call it an omen. Priests might call it a crisis. Khonsu recognized it for what it was, an insurrection against pattern. And because he too was a celestial traveler, he alone could approach with both familiarity and authority. The account of his campaign against them always feels almost mathematical. He does not rush. He studies their spacing, their false brilliance, the way stolen light accumulates. He waits through a narrowing phase, stores force in darkness, then strikes under conditions favorable to concealment. The new moon, when mortals think he has vanished, becomes his preferred hour of correction. There is a grim elegance in that. His invisibility is not weakness. It is tactical disappearance. When he falls upon the rebels, the battle is not merely flashes and noise, though surely there was plenty of that in the stories told by temple fires. It is also geometry restored by force. The stolen lights are broken apart, their strength redistributed, their roots corrected, their leader, often imagined as some serpent-bearing constellation, lord or star tyrant, swollen on borrowed radiance, must finally face Khonsu directly. Here the old devourer returns in full. Not the healer now, not the dream guide, the taker of hearts, the one who removes the interior right to continue. And once the heart is taken, the rebellion ends. Not because every lesser participant is annihilated, though some surely are, but because the organizing will has been consumed. The rest dim, scatter, submit, or are returned to proper stations. In this way, the myth says something simple and severe. Disorder often persists because it is coordinated. Break the center and the fragments lose courage. This warrior form of Khonsu also explains why his healing was trusted. A god who only comforts may fail when the illness fights back. Khonsu could do both. He could enter a room where a patient shook under a spiritual burden, and he could decide whether that burden required soothing, expulsion, or destruction. The family praying beside the bed did not need to understand the full taxonomy of hostile beings. They needed confidence that the god did. His fiercer mythology gave them that confidence. It also made him useful to kings and priests concerned with public order. If a temple was defiled, if omens turned ugly, if strange disturbances seemed to collect around boundaries, storehouses, frontier posts, or royal tombs, Khonsu could be invoked not only as witness, but as enforcer. His lunar surveillance combined naturally with punitive capacity. He saw, then he acted. There is something almost administrative again in this. Nightly inspection, followed by decisive intervention. Egypt loved a god who kept good boundaries. Yet for all this severity, he was not sheer indiscriminate rage. That is crucial. Sekhmet may blaze. Montu may surge. Khonsu, in his terrible form, feels narrower, more exact, more forensic. He is less battlefield frenzy than precise execution under the sign of night. He goes where the infection is. He cuts out what should not remain. Then he withdraws. The moon, after all, does not stay at zenith forever. Even judgment must move along its route. This disciplined violence gave rise to another strand of his mythology, one that prepares the next chapter of his story. A being who can track, expose, measure, and restore alignment is already close to becoming a master of time. The moon is the visible ruler of months. But more than that, it teaches recurrence, interval, sequence, lawful return. Khonsu's severe campaigns were not random acts of celestial policing. They were timed. They depended on phase, on growth and decline, on concealment and revelation, on the exact moment when force should be spent and when it should be stored. So while mortals looked up and thought of the moon as a lamp or a face or a silver boat, Egyptian theology understood that it was also a clock. Khonsu crossed the night. Yes, but in doing so, he measured it, divided it, and governed it. His warrior power could break rebellion among the stars because he knew their timing. His healing could enter suffering at the right hour because he knew when minds and spirits opened or weakened. His protection worked because he understood sequence. And once one begins to think of Khonsu in that way, as the god who not only traverses the heavens, but regulates the intervals by which life is lived, then one is already standing at the entrance to one of his most fascinating myths of all. Because the moonchild who could devour the heart of cosmic rebellion was also cunning enough to gamble with time itself. In the next part, we will step into that strange and brilliant contest where Khonsu meets Thoth in a game of skill. Moonlight is converted into days, and the Egyptian year itself is altered by divine intelligence. If Khonsu had only crossed the heavens, he would still have been important. If he had only healed, he would still have been beloved. If he had only hunted what threatened order, he would still have been feared with reason. But Egyptian myth gave him something even subtler and perhaps more astonishing. It made him a keeper of time, not in the broad solar manner of Ra, whose daily voyage marked the obvious architecture of day and night, but in the finer, more intimate grammar of recurrence, sequence, interval, and return. This was always implicit in the moon. You can feel it even now without becoming religious about it. The moon is not simply there. It changes in countable ways. It teaches patience because its fullness is never immediate. It teaches loss because it never keeps that fullness. It teaches return because it comes back anyway. Ancient Egypt observed all of this with great seriousness. A civilization that depended on timing, flood, festival, planting, burial, royal ceremony, and ritual exactness could not fail to love a god who made the month visible. Khonsu therefore became more than moonlight. He became a regulator of becoming. His phases offered a natural measure for time, but the theology around him went further. Priests and storytellers understood that any god who governs the visible calendar of nights also has some authority over the hidden mechanics by which events ripen. The moon does not only show when time passes. It seems to participate in how things mature. Seeds swell. Minds change. Illnesses ebb and rise. Tides answer. Pregnancies are counted. Ceremonies are fixed. Journeys are timed. Decisions feel different under different phases. Khonsu sat quietly behind all of that. In temple imagination, he did not merely move through time. He apportioned it. Each waxing was increase under supervision. Each waning was reduction under law. Each disappearance was a concealed interval, not an accident. Each return was a renewal properly scheduled. That sort of orderly recurrence made him indispensable to every sphere of life that required more than raw duration. A year is not just long. It must be arranged. A kingdom is not just old. It must remain synchronized with heaven. A ritual is not just sincere. It must happen when the cosmos is ready to receive it. This theological depth appears most vividly in the famous myth where Khonsu contests with Thoth and, by doing so, helps remake the Egyptian year. It is one of those stories that begins with a puzzle so elegant that you almost smile before the stakes become clear. Nut, the sky goddess, had been cursed or constrained by divine decree so that she could not bear her children on any day of the regular year. The year at that stage was counted as 360 days, complete in its own logic and guarded by law. No ordinary day within it could host the births destined to reshape the divine order. Here is where the myth shows its delightful intelligence. The problem is not lack of power. The gods have plenty of that. The problem is legality within cosmic structure. Nut cannot simply defy the terms. Something must happen to time itself. New temporal room must be made, but it cannot be made crudely, because the year is already closed. This is exactly the kind of problem that attracts gods of measure, writing, and cycles. So Thoth, the strategist of wisdom, turns to Khonsu, whose moonlight stores temporal value night after night. The contest between them is usually imagined as a game, often connected with Senate or a similar divine board contest. It is one of my favorite kinds of myth, because it suggests that cosmic reform can arise not only from battle or proclamation, but from wit. The gods do not always solve their problems with thunderbolts. Sometimes they sit down across a board and begin moving pieces. Imagine the setting. Night. Of course. A sacred chamber or cosmic hall where the air seems cooler than it should be. The board between them gleams softly. Thoth, ibis wise and impossible to surprise for long, watches with the patient look of someone who has read too many outcomes to be easily flustered. Khonsu sits opposite, youthful in appearance but far from naive, silvered by his own radiance, already carrying the rhythms of many months within him. Around them perhaps a hush, other divine presences observing. No one careless, because this is not recreation. Not really. This is surgery on the year. The wager is extraordinary. Khonsu will risk portions of his moonlight, fractions of his luminous substance, his measurable temporal power. Thoth, by winning those portions, will convert them into additional days that lie outside the ordinary 360-day structure. These days will not belong to the old year. They will be extra time, carved from lunar brilliance and inserted at the edge of order. Days outside the count, yet still able to hold birth. There is something profoundly Egyptian in that solution. When law blocks necessity, one does not simply smash law. One finds a way to add lawful exception without collapsing the whole. Thoth provides the intellect. Khonsu provides the temporal material. The result is not rebellion against order, but refinement of order. That is why the myth feels so satisfying. It is clever, but not cynical. It respects the cosmos even while it alters it. As the game unfolds, Khonsu loses, or yields, or is gradually outplayed depending on the version and the teller. But the loss is never humiliating. It is creative sacrifice. With each round, a little lunar light is won away from him. This diminishes his store, which beautifully explains why the moon does not always remain full. The myth here folds cosmology and character together. Khonsu can be outmaneuvered. Yes, but in being outmaneuvered, he becomes the source of new possibility. Even his diminishment produces order. Thoth gathers the one moonlight and fashions from it 5 extra days. These become the apogomenal days, days outside the regular year, suspended almost between one order and the next. They are strange days, potent days, liminal days, and on them the divine children can finally be born. Osiris, Horus the Elder in some traditions, Set, Isis, Nephthys, the great figures of Egyptian divine drama, all enter the world through temporal space, made possible by Khonsu's surrendered light. Think about how lovely and eerie that is. The moon gives away part of itself so that myth can happen. Without that loss, no room. Without room, no births. Without births, no later dramas of kingship, death, restoration, conflict, mourning, magic, and resurrection. One lunar god, seated in a game under the sign of intelligence, becomes the hidden donor to nearly all the grief and grandeur that follows in Egyptian mythology. It is one of those quiet structural myths that changes everything without needing noise. The 5 added days also carry their own spiritual atmosphere. Being outside the original count, they are unstable in a sacred way. Special. Not ordinary festival days, not ordinary work days, not entirely safe either. Time loosened from its old frame rarely feels casual. These days became associated with transition, divine birth, heightened ritual significance. and the sense that the normal boundaries of the year had briefly opened to admit something older and more dangerous than routine. Khonsu's relation to time therefore became far more than monthly tracking. He had participated in the engineering of the year. The moon was no longer just a measure within time. It had become a source from which time itself could be expanded. That is an immense theological elevation. A being who can surrender luminous substance and produce days stands very close to the machinery of creation. From there, it is easy to see why later imagination gave him influence over lifespan, timing, fate, and the right moment for things to unfold. If he helps generate the very days in which gods are born, why would he not also touch the question of when mortals die, when kingdoms change, when healing takes hold, when decisions mature? When journeys should begin, Khonsu became a deity of favorable timing, of nights chosen well, of intervals that mattered. Priests and ritual specialists would have paid close attention to his phases for exactly this reason. A healing rite during the waxing moon invited increase in strength. A rite to diminish a hostile influence fit the waning phase better. Full moon nights amplified visibility, revelation, and potency. Dark moon nights favored hidden work, confrontation with what moved unseen, or preparation for renewed emergence. One can almost picture scribes in temple schools making careful notations, teachers explaining why a ceremony delayed by even 2 nights might change in force or meaning. His link to royal timing was also significant. Kingship in Egypt required cosmic alignment. The ruler was not meant to act as an isolated strongman improvising history. He had to move in relation to divine order. Lunar omens, phases, and timing therefore had implications for coronation, military departure, treaty making, and major offerings. A king who ignored the moon ignored a visible register of divine rhythm. Khonsu, quiet, though he often seemed compared to louder gods, had a say in whether power ripened properly or moved out of season. This influence over sequence and timing connects beautifully with his earlier roles. The healer knows when to intervene. The warrior knows when to strike. The traveler knows when to depart and when to wait for better light. The timekeeper knows how all those moments fit together. Khonsu's mythology is not a pile of unrelated episodes. It is one long refinement of a single insight. The moon governs by phases. Therefore, the moon god governs by right timing. Some traditions go even further and imagine him influencing individual lifespans or the tempo at which a person moves through life. Not immortality exactly, though Egypt was never shy about grand hopes, but extension, protection, delay of premature ending, or the granting of enough time to complete what fate had placed in one's hands. A priest finishing a crucial calculation. A ruler stabilizing a fragile reign. A mother surviving long enough to bring forth a child under good signs. Khonsu's favor could mean not endless life, but sufficient life. And honestly, that is often the more merciful gift. There are stories and implications too about his involvement in dreams and prophecy, because dreams happen in time, and not all nights are equal. A dream under a certain moon can carry different weight than a dream under another. The full moon opens. The dark moon hides. Waxing reveals what is forming. Waning strips away what no longer has force. This does not mean every dream became a bureaucratic report from the god, but it does mean people watched the moon and listened differently depending on what it was doing. Khonsu made timing part of interpretation. His contest with Thoth also says something subtle about his character. He is not only beautiful or fearsome. He is useful in cooperation. He can lose without becoming diminished in dignity, because the loss itself generates structure that is rare among gods and rarer among humans. To surrender part of one's brilliance so that the year can hold more life is an act of deep cosmic maturity. Thoth may win the game, but Khonsu's contribution is not passive. He allows his own cyclical incompleteness to become a blessing for everyone who lives inside the calendar thereafter. And perhaps that is why his mythology remains so durable. He never feels static. He changes and remains himself. He can be child and judge, healer and hunter, traveler and clock, giver and enforcer. Even his losses create order. The moon shrinking is no longer sad when one knows that part of its dimming once became room for the gods to be born. Decline itself may hide usefulness. That thought would have mattered in Egypt, a civilization acutely aware of cycles, aging, rise and fall, flood and recession, kings crowned and buried, empires swelling and thinning like the moon itself. Khonsu taught not merely that time passes, but that time can be shaped, interpreted, honored, and sometimes mercifully amended. A closed year can open. A curse can be outwitted. A loss of light can become 5 sacred days. By the time his mythology reaches maturity, he is no longer just the moonchild of the Theban triad. He is a guardian of intervals and a proof that cosmic order is neither rigid nor careless. It can adapt through intelligence. It can make room when room is needed. It can preserve structure while permitting surprise. That is a very comforting kind of divinity, especially in the middle of a human life that rarely unfolds exactly on schedule. And yet the story of Khonsu does not end in pure abstraction. It returns, as Egyptian myths often do, to practical tenderness. The god who helped add days to the year is the same one who watches the road at night, the same one invoked over the sick, the same one whose phases still invite human beings to think in cycles rather than cliffs. His timekeeping is not cold mechanism. It is luminous care spread over recurrence. In the next part, that care widens further. We will move from his mastery of time into his role as protector of travelers, guardian of roads, and companion through dangerous passages. Because once a god can shape the night, measure the month, heal hidden affliction, and lend the year a little extra room, it is only natural that people setting out across desert, river, dream, exile, or grief would lift their eyes and ask the same moon for safe passage. There is a particular kind of fear that only arrives when the road grows quiet. Not the fear of battle drums or public shame or some loud catastrophe that everyone can point at together, but the smaller and stranger fear that comes when the sky is clear. The ground is uncertain, and the next mile has no witness. Ancient Egypt knew that feeling well. Between the cultivated ribbon of the Nile and the wide lands beyond it lay desert tracts, wadis, broken stone, marshy edges, river bends, foreign roads, and border paths where a traveler could vanish so neatly that even grief would struggle to follow. It is no surprise, then, that Khonsu became beloved not only as healer and lunar measurer, but as a protector of those who moved through danger after sunset. A god who crossed the heavens each night already understood what travel meant. He knew distance. He knew uncertainty. He knew the way familiar landmarks lose their confidence in low light. Most of all, he knew that movement through darkness is never merely physical. It changes the mind. The traveler becomes porous. Hope and dread take turns holding the reins, for caravans heading east through the desert, for officials carrying sealed messages, for merchants driving donkeys loaded with copper, linen, incense, or grain, for soldiers marching under dim stars, for pilgrims walking toward remote shrines, and for ordinary people who simply had to cross some lonely stretch before dawn. The moon above was not ornament. It was supervision. When Khonsu shone, the road did not become harmless, but it became legible. That mattered more than comfort. Egyptian religious thought often linked divine protection to correct relationship. A god helped those who invoked him properly, yes, but also those who traveled with the right inner posture. You did not demand the moon guard you as though summoning a servant. You aligned yourself with the order that the moon made visible. You prepared. You purified. You timed your departure. You learned which phase favored which kind of journey. A merchant might prefer a waxing moon if he hoped to increase profit and return with more than he carried out. A pilgrim might watch for a full moon if clarity and revelation were sought. A dangerous mission requiring stealth could begin under a thinning moon, when Khonsu still watched, but concealed his brightness enough to protect intent with shadow. Before departure, it was common in the imagination of temple life to seek blessing through small rites. Water poured over hands, a brief offering of bread, silver or white faience amulets marked with lunar signs tied to the throat or wrist. The traveler would stand facing west or east, depending on the stage of the moon, and speak a prayer that sounds simple to us now, but would have felt deeply practical then. Let the path be visible. Let deceit be uncovered. Let the hidden thing remain hidden from me only until it is safe to know it. Let my feet arrive where my name is expected. There is something so human in that last hope that it almost hurts. Khonsu's protection over roads did not mean he flattened every hazard into safety. Egypt did not imagine the gods as a service for removing all consequence. The desert still burned by day and froze by night. Animals still startled. Thieves still existed. Wheels broke. Water skins leaked. A wrong turn could still open into disaster. Divine protection worked more subtly. A warning dream before departure. A strange delay that prevented one from reaching an ambush on time. Moonlight catching the edge of a ravine exactly when a foot was about to descend into it. A caravan animal refusing a route that later proved cursed or unstable. Khonsu guided by timing, by exposure, by the little interventions that redirect a story without announcing themselves as miracles. Some of the most vivid traditions concern desert caravans, which makes sense. The desert is almost a theology in itself. It strips excess. It enlarges small sounds. It tests memory. A road in the desert exists because people insist on crossing where the land gives them no obvious invitation. Under moonlight, dunes and stone flats can look almost calm enough to trust, which is part of the danger. Distances lay. Shapes soften. A cluster of rocks may resemble a campsite until one reaches it and finds only cold silence. In such places, Khonsu was imagined as a guide not because he carried travelers in his arms, but because he kept falsehood from becoming complete. Stories grew around this. A caravan from Thebes bound for mining regions in the eastern desert loses one of its led men during a dust storm at dusk. The camp is made in a shallow basin. Fear ripens among the others, not only because of the missing man, but because night in the desert magnifies every omission. Water must be counted again. Loads must be checked. Tracks disappear almost as soon as they are found. The moon rises late. Until then, everyone listens to the wind as though it might be translating some hidden verdict. When Khonsu finally clears the horizon, his light does not perform some absurd theatrical rescue. Instead, it reveals something slight. The disturbed line of stones to the north. The faint drag mark near an outcropping. A donkey bridle half buried in sand. Silver buckle catching the light. A search party follows. The missing man is found in a shallow depression. Injured, but alive. Pinned where dusk had hidden the danger. Time. The rescue becomes part of camp memory. No one says the moon picked him up and carried him. They say Khonsu let him be seen. That kind of miracle feels very Egyptian. Visibility is grace. To be made locatable is mercy. Yet the myths and ritual traditions also insist that not every danger on the road was ordinary. Certain stretches were thought vulnerable to entities that fed on confusion, isolation, or spiritual weakness. These were not always grand demons with names that fill papyri. Often they were the lesser and more intimate terrors, shape-changing things, deceivers, whisperers, beings that imitated human cries, false companions appearing on roads, shadows that kept pace too long beside the traveler who was walking alone. Foreign roads, border zones, burial districts, and abandoned shrines were all especially exposed to such presences. Khonsu's lunar nature made him a fitting protector against them because he governed those hours when deception is most active. The moon does not banish all shadow. It negotiates with it. That is exactly what a traveler needs. Under moonlight, illusion has a harder time finishing its lie. The false oasis looks wrong at one angle. The companion's shadow falls in the wrong direction. The inviting path ends too abruptly. The voice that seemed familiar repeats a name with just enough error to make the heart suddenly cautious. Khonsu protected by sharpening perception rather than replacing it. In Temple imagination, priests of Khonsu may have slept near his shrines in search of dream instructions for those preparing difficult journeys. Dream incubation was already a known feature of Egyptian religious life, and Khonsu, as lunar healer and navigator, was perfectly suited to it. A traveler troubled by indecision might sleep in the temple court, head near an offering tray, and dream of a boat crossing calm water, or of a jackal turning away from one path and choosing another, or of a silver hand touching a sealed jar and leaving one mark among several. Priests would interpret these signs in relation to the moon's phase, the traveler's purpose, and the known hazards of the route. Not fortune-telling in the cheap sense, more like divine cartography of possibility. The protection of diplomatic envoys gave his cult even broader relevance. Egypt's alliances did not maintain themselves. Messages had to move. Gifts had to arrive unspoiled. Interpreters had to survive road and intrigue both. A royal messenger bearing treaties or marriage gifts was not simply a man on a horse or a chariot. He was the narrow bridge between kingdoms that might otherwise fall into suspicion and war. Such missions invited both human sabotage and supernatural hostility. Khonsu, whose own movement linked realms, naturally became a guardian of these fragile passages between political worlds. Imagine a diplomatic party moving north toward foreign courts. Their donkeys carry linen, gold worked into ceremonial forms, oils in sealed jars, and tablets or papyrus rolls marked with royal intention. Human enemies may watch from a distance. But in myth, there is always the possibility of more than politics. Spirits of borderlands, hostile, sorcerous influences, old gods of foreign places, resentful of intrusion, or the mere psychic weight of mistrust thickening the road. A moon god can do something here that a sun god perhaps cannot. He can move quietly with the party, keeping silence from becoming panic, revealing danger without provoking it, cooling the temper before one insult becomes a skirmish. There are accounts in later imagination of embassies protected by Khonsu through dream warnings and subtle delay. A wheel pin slips at dusk, forcing a camp to be made earlier than intended. Annoying, yes, but the road ahead would have carried them into a prepared assault. A negotiator falls briefly ill and rests under an acacia. In his sleep, he sees 2 cups on a low table, one clear, one dark. At the foreign court the next day, he refuses the first drink offered and instead asks that his host drink with him from the same vessel. Poison thus fails without public accusation. Again, Khonsu protects by making timing do the work. His care for pilgrims carries perhaps the gentlest form of this patronage. Pilgrimage is travel with inward vulnerability exposed. The pilgrim wants something from the journey that cannot be packed onto a beast or counted in ledgers. Healing, absolution, a vow fulfilled, a child sought, a dead loved one remembered at a distant shrine, a divine answer not obtainable at home. Such travelers attract risk precisely because they are open. Their hope walks in front of them where danger can see it. Khonsu's role here was not only to keep the body safe, but to keep the purpose intact. A pilgrim who arrives hardened, distracted, embittered, or corrupted by fear may reach the shrine and yet fail to arrive spiritually. So the moon god guarded the integrity of the longing itself. Under his light, the pilgrim remembered why the journey began. The road became a discipline of return. Step after step under alternating silence and conversation, under jackal cries and sandals scraping stone, under the white eye of the moon, the heart could be regathered. I have always found that part of his mythology unusually moving. So many divine stories promise grand rescue. Khonsu often promises orientation. That can be the deeper mercy. To know where you are. To remember what you seek. To keep moving toward it when the landscape suggests indifference. Any traveler who has ever crossed a difficult year rather than a difficult desert understands this perfectly. There were also those who traveled by river at night, and for them, Khonsu mattered no less. The Nile by moonlight is beautiful in a way that almost feels like a trap. Silver surface, dark banks, reeds whispering, occasional movement that may be bird, fish, crocodile, or memory. A boatman guided by moonlight relies on reflected line, on the relation between current and bank shadow, on the patience not to overcorrect. Khonsu's protection here meant calm calculation. No panic in cross-current. No dazzled misreading of reflection. No surrender to the mood that the river itself sometimes imposes on the isolated mind. Night fishing crews, ferrymen, priests carrying ritual objects between temple points, and even funerary boats transporting the dead could all fall under his eye. The last category is especially important. The dead, too, were travelers. If Khonsu guided the roads of the living, why would he not also guide the passages of the recently departed, especially through those first dim thresholds where identity is fragile and orientation is everything? Thus the road protector and the celestial traveler meet. The road is earthly, and the road is afterlife. The moon watches both. His protection of children and families on the move may be less celebrated in grand inscriptions, yet it is easy to imagine and deeply consistent with his later character. A mother traveling from one estate to another with 2 children and a servant, leaving before dawn to avoid the heat. A family displaced by flood damage or local shortage. A widow making her way to relatives. These are not heroic caravans. They are ordinary human movement, which means they are exactly the sort of journeys a compassionate moon god would notice. The little body asleep against a basket, the child's fear of strange sounds, the adult counting provisions with anxious fingers. Khonsu's light on such a road is almost parental. This aspect of him made travel theology personal. One did not need to be a royal envoy or grand merchant to need the moon. One only had to be in transit. And transit is one of the most basic human conditions. We are always between something and something else. One house and another. One season and another. One version of ourselves and another. The ancient myths understood this more literally, but they did not understand it less deeply. As his cult matured, Khonsu's protective aspect broadened beyond roads into thresholds more generally. Doors, gates, frontier posts, harbor entries, desert wells, temple pylons, even moments of legal or emotional transition could all be thought of as passages requiring proper oversight. He became a god one might invoke before entering not only a place, but a state. Marriage, illness, negotiation, mourning, return from exile. Safe passage is not always about distance. Sometimes it is about surviving the crossing from one condition of life into another without losing the core of who you are. And yet for all this care, the mythology does not let us forget that the protector of travelers is also the god of dangerous transformation. To accompany people through passages means to know how identity changes when it moves. A traveler is never entirely the same upon arrival. Khonsu, who had himself shifted from devourer to healer, from child to strategist, from visible beacon to unseen judge, understood that deeply. The road under his protection was not a corridor that preserved everything unchanged. It was a chamber in which change could happen without collapse. That realization opens the way into the last great movement of his story. Because a God who keeps others safe through change must also be master of his own transformations. In the final part, we will step into those stranger and more fluid aspects of Khonsu, his shifts between youthful and mature forms, his animal manifestations, his eerie persistence through collapse, and the reason his moonlit wandering came to symbolize not only protection for one night or one journey, but endurance through the whole dark turning of time. The road eventually teaches every traveler the same lesson. Protection is not the same thing as stillness. To be kept safe does not mean to remain unchanged. You arrive altered, sometimes slightly, sometimes beyond recognition. Khonsu knew this because his own divine life was built on change so regular that it became a form of permanence. He was never exactly the same from one night to the next, and yet he remained unmistakably himself. That paradox, changing without ceasing to be, may be his deepest gift. By the later flowering of his mythology, Khonsu was understood as a god of forms as much as phases. The moon already gives the template: crescent, fullness, decline, invisibility, return. Each appearance true, none final. Egyptian religious imagination, always responsive to symbol and function, extended this principle into his personhood. He could appear as the child with the sidelock. He could emerge as a mature divine authority when age, command, or judgment were needed. He could take on animal forms suited to surveillance, pursuit, wisdom, or attack. These were not masks in the shallow sense. They were operational truths, each one answering a real demand within the cosmos. The transformation from youthful Khonsu to adult Khonsu is especially striking because it does not feel like simple growth. It feels like access. The child form remains eternally valid, carrying renewal, approachability, and the quick intelligence of fresh divine force. But there are situations where youth cannot serve as the face of authority. A rebellious spirit may laugh at beauty. A wavering noble may ignore the plea of gentleness. A court in crisis may need not moon-child tenderness, but seasoned command. Then Khonsu matures. One can imagine the shift beginning almost invisibly. The playful softness leaves the mouth. The eyes sharpen and deepen, not growing cruel, only older in knowledge. The body lengthens into the stillness of one who no longer needs to prove motion. The moonlight around him loses some of its silver innocence and takes on the pale severity of cut stone. His voice, if heard, would be lower, not louder. That is often how real authority sounds. It does not need to shout because it is already inside the room before the words arrive. This mature Khonsu is the one best suited to adjudication, to strategic counsel, to grave interventions in temple or court. He is the lunar administrator, the one who knows not only how cycles work, but what they cost. He has seen too many returns to romanticize them. He understands that renewal is holy, yes, but also expensive. Something is always surrendered when something comes back. This form of him would have appealed to priests, rulers, judges, and senior healers. people whose work required calm discernment more than emotional display. And yet he never abandons the child entirely. That is the miracle. His maturity does not erase his renewal. The old and the young coexist in him without collapsing each other. Egypt admired that sort of layered integrity. The best kings were not boys pretending to be old men, nor old men attempting to mimic youth. The best order held continuity and freshness together. Khonsu models exactly that. The moon grows and shrinks without becoming less moon. His animal transformations push this principle even further. Egyptian gods often move through animal symbolism because animals reveal specialized powers with a clarity that human language sometimes blurs. Khonsu's association with the baboon is especially telling. Baboons in Egyptian thought were linked with lunar behavior and with alertness at threshold hours, those uncanny moments before sunrise or during changing light when cries ring differently across the land. A baboon form for Khonsu suggests watchfulness, social intelligence, and the kind of quick, coordinated response that danger often requires. Imagine him in that form, not as some awkward hybrid to be catalogued, but as a concentration of instinct and divine intelligence. Hands agile, eyes bright in uncertain light, a creature capable of seeing from walls, rocks, and ruined precincts where an ordinary human would misstep. As baboon, Khonsu can investigate what is half hidden, climb what cannot be walked, and sense disturbance in the social field, fear moving through a group, deception tightening among the members of a caravan, the moment when one cry of alarm is real and another is bait. The ibis form reveals something else. Here the lunar god brushes close to the world of Thoth, as many Egyptian deities do at the edges of domain. The ibis is a bird of measured stance, probing intelligence, marshland, patience, and strange elegance. If Khonsu takes this shape, he becomes a collector of signs. The road protector turns investigator. The god who usually moves by obvious celestial path enters the reeds, the margins, the wet places where traces are partial and truth must be extracted carefully from mud, reflection, and silence. I like to imagine that this form belonged to nights when no battle was yet necessary, but clarity was. Something wrong is happening around a sacred grove. Offerings are being diverted. A sickness returns in cycles that imply intention rather than accident. A message has vanished between two temple houses. Khonsu as ibis does not roar. He attends. He notices. He waits. There is holiness in that kind of attention. It says that truth is not always brought forth by force. Sometimes it is drawn out slowly, like a hidden fish from dark water. Then there is the falcon aspect. This one feels rarer in his mythic temperament, but no less revealing. Falcon form belongs to speed, aerial command, and attack from above. If Khonsu enters it, we are back near his more martial responsibilities, but now with elegance rather than the ferocity of the heart devourer. As Falcon, he is the sudden correction no one anticipated. The enemy, looking only horizontally, never thinks to fear the angle from heaven. That too is lunar wisdom. Human beings often prepare for the obvious approach and neglect the one arriving silently from an unexpected height. These transformations do not merely decorate the mythology. They make a theological point. Divine help, is not singular. One form of protection does not solve every danger. A child healer for a fevering mind. A mature judge for a matter of order. A baboon for hidden disturbances. An ibis for patient investigation. A falcon for the swift interruption of predatory force. Khonsu becomes a library of responses. To love such a god is to believe that the cosmos may contain more than one answer to suffering. By the later and more reflective phases of Egyptian religion, these powers also fed into a larger sense of Khonsu's endurance. Some gods blaze brightest in one city or one political period and then dim. Khonsu certainly had historical peaks, especially in Thebes, but the moon itself kept renewing his relevance. Dynasties changed. Borders shifted. Temples were enlarged, neglected, restored, rededicated. Foreigners entered. Priests revised hymns. Yet the moon continued to cross above ruined and prosperous roofs alike. So Khonsu endured, not merely because institutions preserved him, but because the sky kept making his argument every month. This is where his mythology takes on that especially sleepy, almost philosophical tenderness that makes it so enduring. He becomes not just a figure in stories, but a pattern for surviving history. A civilization can decline. A temple can lose its roof. A language can thin out on the tongue. A family can be reduced to memory and one surviving child. But the moon returns, not unchanged, not untouched by clouds or the season's angle, but present enough to begin reckoning again. Khonsu's eternal wandering is therefore not restlessness. It is fidelity through repetition. Prophetic and late theological traditions loved this about him. When other structures crack, the moon remains a schedule. When kingship grows uncertain, the moon still keeps count. When plague, war, or foreign occupation confuses the old routes, travelers can still depart by lunar light. Even if every archive burned, a priest or mother or ferryman could still look up and know the phase. That kind of durability is almost humble compared with grand creator myths, but it is no less profound. The cosmos continues to offer signs. Order has not resigned. This persistence also explains why Khonsu could become a god of the future as much as of the present. His cycles train expectation. They tell the watcher that absence is not always ending, that darkness may be procedural rather than final. This would have mattered terribly to grieving people. The mourner, waiting through the first month after a death. The patient who has survived the fever but not yet recovered strength. The family in political exile hoping to return. The ruler waiting for a favorable sign. All of them could look to a lunar god and see doctrine without words. What vanishes may return in altered form. What wanes may not be failing, only preparing another shape. I have always found that more consoling than the promise of uninterrupted light sounds lovely until one remembers that human beings are not built for it. We need intervals. We need concealment. We need time to gather ourselves in shadow. Khonsu sanctifies that without romanticizing danger. The dark phase is real. It can be frightening. Yet it belongs to a cycle, and the cycle itself has guardian intelligence within it. This is perhaps why his mythology can hold both the terrifying and the tender without tearing. He is old enough as a concept to remember fear, In the oldest texts, he is not safe in a simple way. He can consume. He can judge. He can become something no mortal wants to meet, while guilty or corrupted. But over centuries, that severity is not erased. It is harnessed into protection, healing, and timing. The frightening moon becomes the moon that keeps watch. The devourer becomes the defender who knows exactly what must sometimes be devoured. In temple life, this synthesis would have felt deeply practical. The same God invoked over a sleepless child might also be asked to punish an oathbreaker. The same shrine that hosted healing petitions might receive offerings from travelers before a dangerous departure. Cheng, the same lunar festival that celebrated beauty and cyclical rebirth, might contain darker hymns, acknowledging what Khonsu destroys to keep the road open. Ancient religion rarely separated life into neat departments. The God who can guide you home is often the God who knows how close you came to not returning. As Egyptian culture moved through later periods and encountered Greek and Roman worlds, Khonsu's image necessarily shifted in emphasis. But the core remained recognizable. He was still linked to the moon, to youth, to healing, to protection. He could be compared, blended, or translated through foreign categories, but he remained stubbornly Egyptian in one important sense. He was always relational, not a lonely celestial machine, not merely a symbol. He was a God who crossed, responded, heard, adjusted, and returned. His divinity was kinetic. He did not sit above process. He inhabited it. That may be why he still feels psychologically alive now, even to listeners far from Thebes, far from hieroglyphs, far from the smell of temple stone after sunset. Everyone knows what it is to need safe passage. Everyone knows what it is to feel changed by a month. Everyone knows what it is to hope that some form of order still exists in the dark, even when one cannot see the whole arrangement. Khonsu answers those very old human conditions without asking us to become ancient in order to understand him. We only need a night sky and a life that has ever unsettled us. So picture him now in his fullest maturity as the story closes. Not only the child of Amun and Mut, not only the silver traveler, not only the one who healed the foreign princess, or gambled away moonlight so the year could open, or hunted what should not have crossed into the ordered world. Picture instead the complete Khonsu, the young face capable of old decisions, the old wisdom able to appear with a child's renewal, the hand that blesses, the claw that tears corruption free, the God who counts time and also gives courage to those crossing it. He moves over temple courts, over ruined pylons, over sleeping houses, over royal tombs and fishermen's nets, over women in labor, scribes bent over calculations, children dreaming, old men sitting awake in courtyards, caravans still an hour from camp, priests listening for a sign, and mourners who have forgotten for a moment that the world continues. He says nothing in words they can quite hear, yet his motion says enough. Keep going. Count gently. Not every darkness is abandonment. Not every loss of light is defeat. Travel can still end in arrival. And because this is Egypt, because endings, there are never only endings. His final gift is not escape from time, but companionship through it. He does not stop the month from thinning. He accompanies it. He does not abolish danger. He walks the dangerous passage. He does not promise that every traveler will keep every version of the self that first departed. He promises only that change can still occur within order, and that order can remain beautiful even when it is difficult. The moon above the Nile, above desert roads, above Karnak columns and village roofs, above kings and servants alike, kept making that promise for century after century. And even when the old temples fell quiet, even when the chants changed language, even when foreign names covered old stone, the moon crossed on schedule. Khonsu, in that sense, was never fully gone. A god tied to return always leaves a trace of return behind him. So let the story settle where his own journey always settles, not in final stillness, but in the calm certainty of another crossing completed, the silver edge lowering, the stars holding their places, the road behind you a little longer than before, the road ahead a little less frightening than it was an hour ago. Somewhere beyond sight, the young old god prepares again to vanish, to renew, to reappear. The dark keeps its mysteries, but not all of them are hostile. Some are simply waiting for the right phase to be seen. Rest now beneath his patient circuit. Let the month loosen around you. Let the old fears dim just enough to be bearable. Let the healer keep watch. Let the traveler guide. Let the judge stand at the boundary. Let the changing face in the sky remind you that endurance does not require hardness, only rhythm. Khonsu goes on crossing. The heavens go on receiving him, and under that quiet, recurring light, the heart can finally unclench, the mind can drift, and the long Egyptian night can close around the world without malice, only with distance, silver, memory, and the promise that what returns need not return unchanged, to remain true. Good night.